Hello. Next week we're going to resume and finish our series on Romans. Over the past 3 years we've been looking at Romans in detail, and you can hear all the talks that have been given on Romans by going to the talk section of the Sheffield Vineyard website. If you go to the right hand side, you'll see a list of talks. Click on the Romans one and you'll get there. All 3 years worth you can have a look at if you're so inclined to do so. However, I thought that it might be really helpful if we looked at an overview in preparation for this last instalment of Romans coming up starting next week. And so this week I'm going to give you 5 short talks as part of an overview. And this is the first of these short talks, and we'll be looking today at the context of Rome at the time that the letter to the Romans was written. And then we'll split the text into 4 sections and look at each section a day at a time. Okay, so let's get going. The biblical book Romans was a letter sent by an apostle called Paul to the early church in Rome. Now, the thing about Paul we need to be aware of in the first instance is he has history. He was not always the encouraging chap that we see him being in his letter. He was born to the Jewish social elite. He was well known. He was an eminent theologian, a zealot for Judaism. He was highly educated and was taught by the Jewish lawyer Gamaliel, I don't know quite how you pronounce his name. He was fluent in Latin and Greek and Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke, and Hebrew. And he was very wealthy from an aristocratic heritage from Tarsus, which was the largest trade centre in the Mediterranean on the coast at that time. He was also very well versed in politics and philosophy and was rather expert in particularly Stoic philosophy. Lastly, he was well liked and admired by many people. So in his early career, Saul, which was what he was known as then, he took a particular disliking towards followers of Jesus. And he made it his duty to personally oversee the eradication of Christianity by all means, including execution. But all that changed when, on a road to Damascus, God had a chat with him. The change in Saul's life was so big, it's really incomparable. It was like he turned from Voldemort to Potter. He turned from opposing Christians to being a forerunner in the pro-Christianity campaign. It was around this time that Saul, which was his Hebrew name, started to use his Roman name, Paul. And after his dramatic conversation, Paul started to preach the gospel of God for about 20 years. And he moved from city to city, planting churches and writing letters to them and encouraging them to live in a correct way. And he also proclaimed the gospel message wherever he went. And Paul's plan was to plant growing, self-propagating, self-governing, self-supporting colonies of Christian followers in all the major cities in the Eastern Mediterranean. And his final act was to collect money to give to impoverished followers in Jerusalem. And so, having collected the money, Paul was waiting in Greece for months for the weather to improve so he can cross a sea there on his way to Jerusalem. And it was probably whilst he was waiting in the Greek city of Corinth that he wrote Romans in around about AD 57. Now, in the New Testament, there are 27 books, 21 of which are epistles or letters written to individuals or groups of Christians, and of those 21 letters, 13 were written by Paul. Unlike letters or emails today, letters written in the time of Paul were expensive and difficult to send. There were, of course, no royal mails in the first century Italy. Archaeologists have found around 14,000 letters dating from the period Paul was alive, and it is clear that most letters were short. They ranged typically from about 20 to 200 words. A couple of letters from the time were much larger. Seneca's, I think that's how you pronounce his name, Seneca's letter was 4,000 words and was seen to be an all-time record. Most of Paul's letters were around 1,300 words, but his letter to the Romans was 7,000 words long. And therefore Romans isn't just Paul's longest letter, but it's the longest letter anyone has ever found from ancient times. But that's not the only reason why Paul's letter to the Romans is unusual. The opening and closing sections involving greetings and farewells are huge. And the last chapter is simply a list of people to whom he is sending his love. Secondly, it's more like a lecture in nature and lacks the kind of chattiness of many of his other letters. Thirdly, it was written to a church that Paul has neither started nor ever visited before, but Paul seems eager to forge a relationship with the church in Rome, and it seems to him to be a really strategic place. Lastly, the letter is, it's way more intellectual than all the other letters. Many letters by Paul were sent to deal with specific problems, and that's not really the case in Romans, although there are clearly some matters that he has addressed. And so given its size and unusual character, Romans is a very special addition to the epistles, and it must have been off the scale expensive. No doubt Paul spent considerable time and energy writing it. So let's get back to Paul himself. Paul was an apostle. Today we might see apostles as missionaries. They were people sent out by the church to tell other people about Jesus. And Paul was the first apostle to be sent out to talk specifically to Gentiles or non-Jews. And we know that the church in Rome initially comprised of both Jews and Gentile people. But when the Emperor Claudius expelled all the Jewish people from Rome, the church in Rome was made up almost entirely of Gentiles, non-Jewish Roman citizens. However, about 5 years later, Jewish people were allowed to return to Rome, and so the church there began to welcome back Jews who followed Jesus. But when the Jews returned, they realized that the church in Rome had become very non-Jewish in nature, and there then arose a lot of tension between Jesus followers who were Jews and Jesus followers who were Gentiles. And people disagreed on how to follow Jesus and what customs they should or shouldn't include. And then lots of debate started on whether the church should eat things like kosher food or observe the Sabbath and a whole bunch of other things. And so Paul wrote his letter to bring about some unification and to give some guidance. And that's really important. The whole purpose of the letter is to bring about unification. And the framework on which he hung his specific answers to the specific issues that the people were talking about at the time was the gospel. And his letter was a full and detailed explanation of the good news of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. And it would seem to me that many different scholars have divided Romans up into sections basically in different ways. I mean, I've read a few books about Romans now, and it would seem that many different scholars have separated into different parts, but I would say that most scholars have separated the letter into 4 sections. The first section loosely comprises of the first 4 chapters, which shows how the gospel reveals God's wrath and righteousness. It happens to be also that righteousness is a key theme that flows across the whole book. The second section would be chapters 5 to 8, and that section shows how the gospel brings about a new way of living because of God's grace. And the third section would be chapters 9 to 11, which show how the gospel is the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel and how his promises now apply to the Gentiles as well. And then fourthly, chapters 12 to 16 show how the gospel, because it applies to both Jews and Gentiles, unifies the church. And so that's the end of this first short talk giving an overview of Romans. And tomorrow we're going to look at the first 4 chapters. And I would really recommend that you have a look at something online called the Bible Project. And they have a great overview of Romans, which I found really helpful as I've written these talks. So I hope you've enjoyed it so far, and I really hope to see you tomorrow too. Thanks very much.